So now to that diplomatic standoff between Ottawa and Riyadh. Tensions escalated again tonight. Coming up, we will dive into the propaganda whipping up anti-Canada resentment in Saudi Arabia.
But first, the Prime Minister is speaking out for the first time, and he's not backing down. Canada will unapologetically defend human rights anywhere in the world. That was the very simple message that Trudeau delivered firmly, if politely, today. David Cochrane digs deeper into how Ottawa is playing its hand.
Even in the middle of a diplomatic feud, the show must go on. But this high-tech government funding announcement in Montreal quickly became about Saudi Arabia.
We continue to engage with the government of Saudi Arabia. The Minister of Foreign Affairs had a long conversation with the Foreign Minister yesterday, and diplomatic talks continue.
Chrystia Freeland's long conversation did not bring a quick end to this feud, at least not from the Saudi perspective.
Canada knows what it needs to do. Canada started this, and it's up to Canada to find a way out of it.
That's easier said than done.
It's quite a quagmire. We're now dealing with a kingdom that is accustomed to getting its way.
Accustomed with getting its way, not accustomed with being lectured about human rights on Twitter by a Canadian cabinet minister, which means the solution may lie in pushing things up the ladder.
And I think that dialogue needs to happen between leaders of government on a direct basis. I don't think this has been handled well to this stage.
Or inclining down.
It appears as if the Saudis are calling for an apology or some sort of public take back, if you will. Very difficult to do in these circumstances when this government in particular has staked its claim on human rights and in particular women's rights.
Is offering an apology to Saudi Arabia something you would consider?
Canadians have always expected our government to speak strongly, firmly, clearly, and politely about the need to respect human rights at home and around the world. We will continue to do that. We will continue to stand up.
So if the PM isn't going to apologize, and that seems pretty obvious there, David, what steps is Canada willing to take to try and de-escalate things?
Well, you know, Rosie, Chrystia Freeland's been pretty busy since all of this started, and she's taking two political tacks here. One, she's calling countries in the Middle East and in Europe, seeking their interventions and their advice in ways to resolve this. Notably, she's spoken to Sweden and Germany, who have had similar disputes with Saudi Arabia in the past. And secondly, she's dealing directly with Saudi Arabia, and I'm told that could include another phone call with the foreign minister if things don't calm down.
Okay, at the official level, Canada is trying to figure out what exactly Saudi Arabia's retaliations mean for Canada. Any word on that part of it?
Yeah, they're trying to quantify some things, the impact on hospitals and universities and on farmers, and they're also trying to get clarity on reports that Saudi Arabia has ordered a sell-off of its Canadian assets. This was something that was reported in the Financial Times, and Canada, I'm told, is trying to see if this is in fact the case and what it would mean if it is true. But in the short term, Rosie, no apology is coming, and this issue is staying with Chrystia Freeland right now. It is not going up to the Prime Minister's office.
Okay, David Cochrane, thanks for that. Okay, so that's the game of diplomacy. But what about all the real people caught in the middle of this? Hajj is the annual Muslim pilgrimage to Mecca. It's quickly approaching, and many Canadian Muslims are now afraid to go. Katie Nicholson looks at that. This travel agency is now something of a crisis center. Jamil Ahmed working two phones at once with nervous Muslims who pay thousands to take the trip of a lifetime and are now backing out.
60% call is all the issue, what will happen, what will happen.
Every Muslim is expected to undertake the Hajj, a religious pilgrimage to sacred sites at least once. Yesterday, Ahmed cancelled 15 trips because of escalating tensions between Canada and Saudi Arabia. Saudi's national air carrier has cancelled all flights to Canada starting next week, which could strand hundreds of travelers there well beyond the end of the Hajj. Overstaying an approved visit to Saudi Arabia could land you a fine or time behind bars. Ottawa is still trying to figure out how many Canadians will be affected and what it can do to help.
I hope no one gets stuck, but if they do, I encourage them to reach out to our emergency watch center or call our embassy.
Some people are still willing to risk it. Faisal Halim and his wife left for Riyadh today.
Now we have no idea how we are going to get back to Canada.
Still, Halim isn't worried he'll be stuck. He is, after all, a man of faith.
We ordinary people who are going for Hajj in 2019 have nothing to do with all this politics.
Malik Mushtaq is less confident. He estimates his business could lose millions in religious travel package sales if two countries don't soon bury the hatchet.
As a Canadian, is our government and Saudi government, please solve this problem.
A solution which seems unlikely anytime soon. Katie Nicholson, CBC News, Toronto.
And travelers aren't the only ones who could pay a price for this dispute. Last night, we talked about the Saudi students who may soon have to leave this country, and among them, medical students who contribute a lot to our healthcare system. The University of Toronto has trained over 1,000 Saudi doctors in the last 40 years. There are 216 Saudi medical residents and fellows working in hospitals around the city. 225 are providing similar service in Montreal through McGill's medical program. In total, Canada has some 800 Saudi doctors in training. Pulling them out would likely put more strain on an already overtaxed system.
And while Canadians ponder this whole messy tangle, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is also abuzz with insults and attempts to shame Canada online and on the air. Here's a sense of what they're saying.
أعربت موسكو عن دعمها للسعودية في وجه ما وصفتها بالنظرة الآمرة من قبل كندا.
Saudi broadcasters quick with anti-Canada reports.
في كندا الحريم أعلى نسبة اضطهاد عليهم.
In Canada, women are highly persecuted, a guest just said. That's interesting. Let's have a look. According to a 2017 report by the Cato Institute, Canada scored a 10 out of 10 in terms of women's security and women's freedom of movement. Saudi Arabia, for the record, scored a 5 for women's security and a 0 for women's freedom of movement. Another claim about Canada's persecution of prisoners of conscience, using Holocaust denier Ernst Zundel as an example, as well as the controversial Jordan Peterson, who is not in prison. A virtual Saudi electronic army has unleashed a series of anti-Canada tweets, too, and launched a hashtag. Hashtag Saudis are deeply concerned about, followed by a wave of tweets pointing out Canada's human rights hypocrisy, Quebec's sovereignty, Canada's treatment of Indigenous people.
If you're a good global citizen...
Human rights activist el-Baghdadi says the kingdom's fury about Canada is reminiscent of how the Crown Prince has handled Qatar and Yemen.
We have been watching Mohammed bin Salman for several years now, and he's not good at walkbacks. Whenever he's cornered, he doubles down.
He said he's heard from worried Canadians in Saudi Arabia.
They're nervous because they watched what happened with Qatar, and they know that this young prince, Mohammed bin Salman, does not seem to have, he doesn't seem to have any kind of impulse control. There's always this escalation. And the question is, what is the next, what comes next? Is he going to ask Canadians to leave the country?
Leave the country? That's the tone of this Saudi political cartoon. A Canadian telling a Saudi to release the activists, and the response to the shocked Canadian, get out. Okay, so that's the, well, let's call it creative response to all of this in the Saudi media. What's happening in Western media? Outside Canada, it's been very quiet, with one notable exception. For the first time in its history, the Washington Post has published an editorial in Arabic today, and it is a fearlessly outspoken defense of Canada in this dispute. It reads, in part, what Ms. Freeland and Canada correctly understand is that human rights and basic liberty are universal values, not the property of kings and dictators to arbitrarily grant and remove on a whim. It is great to see Canada holding aloft the human rights banner. But Canada should not have to do this alone. As diplomatic relations between the two countries worsen, a possible reprieve for a Saudi man seeking asylum in Canada. He was scheduled to be deported this morning, but the United Nations asked Ottawa to keep him here until his case is investigated further. We've changed his name and his wife's because they're worried about the safety of their relatives in Saudi Arabia. Jayla Bernstein has their story.
A symbol of the future that Noura wants for her family hangs on the living room wall.
This is a country for me and for my kids.
Noura and her husband Omar hope to start their new lives here in Montreal.
I leave everything in my country to live together.
but they're not together. Omar is now in hospital, but he was being held in this detention center. His wife and children's asylum applications are being processed, but Omar was declared ineligible. He originally came to Canada alone, fearing for his safety, after he was accused of criticizing Saudi Arabia's actions in Yemen. He then withdrew his claim to travel back to Saudi Arabia to help his wife, who'd been arrested and detained. In Canada, you need to wait a year to reapply for asylum. Omar's lawyers have been searching for a way to help him stay.
The situation is quite clear in Saudi Arabia right now, especially for Shias. We don't understand why Canada didn't intervene before.
Omar was supposed to be on a flight to Saudi Arabia this morning, but the United Nations Human Rights Committee stepped in, asking Canada to delay the deportation while they examine the case.
It is obviously Canada's sovereign right and duty to make its own decisions as an independent country, and we will do that. But we will weigh very carefully what the UN has asked.
At an event in Montreal, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was asked about the case, specifically about deporting someone to a country his government has been critical of.
We always expect, and Canadians expect, that our immigration system, which is based on rules, on values, on principles that are very clearly laid out, be followed in its integrity, and that's exactly what we're going to do.
Nora remains hopeful.
My kids every day told me what time my father come back, what time.
Omar is expected to have a detention review hearing tomorrow morning. Jayla Bernstein, CBC News, Montreal.